Okay, and here we are again reading from Alfred Korzybski's Science and Sanity. And as was suggested in the preliminary text, to read chapters 2 for pages 15-16, which 15-16 is the meaning of these symbols, and book 2. So right now we are on chapter 4 of book 1. And okay. So chapter 4 on structure. No satisfactory justification has ever been made for connecting in any way the consequences of mathematical reasoning with the physical world. E.T. Bell. Any student of science, or of the history of science, can hardly miss two very important tendencies which pervade the work of those who have accomplished most in this field. The first tendency is to base science more and more on experiments. The other is toward greater and more critical verbal rigor. The one tendency is to devise more and better instruments and train the experimenters. The other is to invent better verbal forms, better forms of representation and of theories, so as to present a more coherent account of the experimental facts. The second tendency has an importance equal to that of the first. A number of isolated facts does not produce a science any more than a heap of bricks produces a house. The isolated facts must be put in order and brought into mutual structural relations in the form of in the form of some theory. Then only do we have a science, something to start from, to analyze, ponder on, criticize, and improve. Before this, something can be criticized and improved, it must first be produced, so the investigator who discovers some fact or who formulates some scientific theory does not often waste his time. Even his errors may be useful because they may stimulate other scientists to investigate and improve. Scientists found long ago that the common language in daily use is of little value in science. This language gives us a form of representation of very old structure in which we find it impossible to give a full coherent account of ourselves or of the world around us. Each science has to build a special terminology adapted to its own special purposes. This problem of a suitable language is of serious importance. Too little do we realize what a hindrance a language of antiquated structure is. Such a language does not help, but actually prevents correct analysis through the semantic habits and structural implications embodied in it. The last may be of great antiquity and bound up by necessity with primitive-made structural implications, or as we say, metaphysics, involving primitive semantic reactions. The above explains why the popularization of science is such a difficult and perhaps even a semantically dangerous problem. We attempt to translate a creative and correct language which has a structure similar to the structure of the experimental facts into a language of different structure entirely foreign to the world around us and ourselves. Although the popularization of science will probably remain an impossible task, it remains desirable that the results of science should be made accessible to the layman, if means could be found which do not, by necessity, involve misleading accounts. It seems that such methods are at hand, and these involve structural and semantic considerations. The term structure is frequently used in modern scientific literature, but, to the best of my knowledge, only Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein have devoted serious attention to this problem, and much remains to be done. These two authors have analyzed or spoken about the structure of propositions, but similar notions can be generalized to languages considered as a whole. To be able to consider the structure of one language of a definite structure, we must produce another language of a different structure, in which the structure of the first can be analyzed. This procedure seems to be new when actually performed, although it has been foreseen by Russell. If we produce a non-Aristotelian system based on relations, order, structure, etc., we shall be able to discuss profitably the Aristotelian system, which does not allow asymmetrical relations and so cannot be analyzed by Aristotelian means. The dictionary meaning of structure is given somewhat as follows. Structure: manner in which a building or organism or other complete whole is constructed, supporting framework or whole of the essential parts of something. The structure of a house, machine, animal, organ, poem, sentence of loose structure. Its structure is ingenuous. Ornament should emphasize and not disguise the lines of structure, etc. The implications of the term structure are clear even from its daily sense. To have structure, we must have a complex of ordered and interrelated parts. Structure is analyzed in Principia Mathematica and is also simply explained in Russell's more popular works. The Tractatus of Wittgenstein is built on structural considerations, although not much is explained about structure, for the author apparently assumes the reader's acquaintance with the works of Russell. One of the fundamental functions of mental processes is to distinguish. We distinguish objects by certain characteristics, which are usually expressed by adjectives. If by a higher order abstraction we consider individual objects not in some perfectly fictitious isolation, but as they appear empirically as members of some aggregate or collection of objects, we find characteristics which belong to the collection and not to an isolated object. Such characteristics as arise from the fact that the objects belong to a collection are called relations. In such collections, we have the possibility of ordering the objects, and so, for instance, we may discover a relation that one object is before or after the other, or that A is the father of B. There are many ways in which we can order a collection, and many relations which we can find. It is important to notice that order and relations are, for the most part, empirically present, and that, therefore, this language is fit to represent the facts as we know them. The structure of the actual world is such that it is impossible entirely to isolate an object. An Aristotelian subject-predicate language, with its tendency to treat objects as in isolation and to have no place for relations, impossible in complete isolation, obviously has a structure not similar to the structure of the world, in which we deal only with collections of which the members are related. Obviously, under such empirical conditions, only a language originating in the analysis of collections, and therefore a language of relations, order, etc., would have a similar structure to the world around us. From the use of a subject-predicate form of language alone, many of the fallacious, antisocial, and individualistic metaphysics and semantic reactions follow, which we will not analyze here, except to mention that their structural implications follow the structure of the language they use. If we carry the analysis a step further, we can find relations between relations, as for instance, the similarity of relations. We follow the definition of Russell. Two relations are said to be similar if there is one-to-one correspondence between the terms of their fields, which is such that whenever two terms have the relation P, their correlates have the relation Q, and vice versa. For example, two series are similar when their terms can be correlated without change of order. An accurate map is similar to the territory it represents. A book spelled phonetically is similar to the sound when read, etc. When two relations are similar, we say that they have a similar structure, which is defined as the class of all relations similar to the given relation. We see that the terms collection, aggregate, class, order, relations, structure are interconnected, each implying the others. If we decide to face empirical reality boldly, we must accept the Einstein-Minkowski four-dimensional language, for space and time cannot be separated empirically, and so we must have a language of similar structure and consider the facts of the world as series of interrelated ordered events to which, as above explained, we must ascribe structure. Einstein's theory, in contrast to Newton's theory, gives us such a language similar in structure to the empirical facts as revealed by science, 1933, and common experience. The above definitions are not entirely satisfactory for our purpose. To begin with, let us give an illustration and indicate in what direction some reformulation could be made. Let us take some actual territory in which cities appear in the following order: Paris, Dresden, Warsaw, when taken from the west to the east. If we were to build a map of this territory and place Paris between Dresden and Warsaw, thus, so the actual territory, Paris, Dresden, Warsaw, and the map, Dresden, Paris, Warsaw, we should say that the map was wrong, or that it was an incorrect map, or that the map has a different structure from the territory. If speaking roughly, we should try in our travels to orient ourselves by such a map, we should find it misleading. It would lead us astray, and we might waste a great deal of unnecessary effort. In some cases, even a map of wrong structure would bring actual suffering and disaster, as for instance, in a war or in the case of an urgent call for a physician. Two important characteristics of maps should be noticed. A map is not the territory it represents, but if correct, it has a similar structure to the territory, which accounts for its usefulness. If the map could be ideally correct, it would include, in a reduced scale, the map of the map, the map of the map of the map, and so on endlessly, a fact first noticed by Royce. If we reflect upon our languages, we find that at best, they must be considered only as maps. A word is not the object it represents, and languages exhibit also this peculiar self-reflexiveness, that we can analyze languages by linguistic means. This self-reflexiveness of languages introduces serious complexities which can only be solved by the theory of multiordinality given in Part 7. The disregard of these complexities is tragically disastrous in daily life and science. It has been mentioned already that the known definitions of structure are not entirely satisfactory. The terms relation, order, structure are interconnected by implication. At present, we usually consider order as a kind of relation. With the new four-dimensional notions taken from mathematics and physics, it may be possible to treat relations and structure as a form of multidimensional order. Perhaps theoretically such a change is not so important, but from a practical, applied, educational, and semantic point of view, it seems very vital. Order seems neurologically simpler and more fundamental than relation. It is a characteristic of the empirical world which we recognize directly by our lower nervous centers, or senses, and with which we can deal with great accuracy by our higher nervous centers, or thinking. This term seems most distinctly of the organism as a whole character, applicable both to the activities of the higher as well as lower nervous centers, and so structurally it must be fundamental. The rest of this volume is devoted to showing that the common Aristotelian system and language which we inherited from our primitive ancestors differ entirely in structure from the well-known and established 1933 structure of the world, ourselves and our nervous systems included. Such antiquated map language by necessity must lead us to semantic disasters, as it imposes and reflects its unnatural structure on the structure of our doctrines and institutions. Obviously, under such linguistic conditions, a science of man was impossible. Differing in structure from our nervous system, such language must also disorganize the functioning of the latter and lead us away from sanity. This once understood, we shall see clearly that researches into the structure of language and the adjustment of the structure to the structure of the world and ourselves, as given by science at each date, must lead to new languages, new doctrines, institutions, and in fine may result in a new and saner civilization involving new semantic reactions, which may be called the scientific era. The introduction of a few new and the rejection of some old terms suggests desirable structural changes and adjusts the structure of the language map to the known structure of the world, ourselves, and the nervous system, and so leads us to new semantic reactions and a theory of sanity. As words are not the objects which they represent, structure and structure alone becomes the only link which connects our verbal processes with the empirical data. To achieve adjustment and sanity and the conditions which follow from them, we must study structural characteristics of this world first, and then only build languages of similar structure instead of habitually ascribing to the world of the primitive structure of our language. All our doctrines, institutions, etc. depend on verbal arguments. If these arguments are conducted in a language of wrong and unnatural structure, our doctrines and institutions must reflect that linguistic structure and so become unnatural and inevitably lead to disasters. I'm going to read that last sentence one more time. If these arguments are conducted in a language of wrong and unnatural structure, our doctrines and institutions must reflect that linguistic structure and so become unnatural and inevitably lead to disasters. That languages as such all have some structure or other is a new and perhaps unexpected notion. Moreover, every language having a structure by the very nature of language reflects in its own structure that of the world as assumed by those who evolved the language. In other words, we read unconsciously into the world of structure of the language we use. The guessing and ascribing of a fanciful, mostly primitive, assumed structure to the world is precisely what philosophy and metaphysics do. The empirical search for world structure and the building of new languages or theories of necessary or similar structure is, on the contrary, what science does. Anyone who will reflect upon these structural peculiarities of language cannot miss the semantic point that the scientific method uses the only correct language method. It develops in the natural order, while metaphysics of every description uses the reversed and ultimately a pathological order. Since Einstein and the newer quantum mechanics, it has become increasingly evident that the only content of knowing is of a structural character, and the present theory attempts a formulation of this fact in a generalized way. If we build a non-Aristotelian system by the aid of new terms and of methods excluded by the Aristotelian system, and stop some of our primitive habits of thought and semantic reactions, as for instance the confusion of order of abstractions, reverse the reversed order, and so introduce the natural order in our analysis, we shall then find that all human knowing exhibits a structure similar to scientific knowledge, and appears as the knowing of structure. But in order to arrive at these results, we must depart completely from the older systems and must abandon permanently the use of the word, the use of the is of identity. It would seem that the overwhelming importance for mankind of systems based on relations, order, structures, etc. depend on the fact that such terms allow of an exact and logical treatment, and two relations of similar structure have all their logical characteristics in common. It becomes obvious that as in the Aristotelian system, we cannot deal in such terms. Higher rationality and adjustment were impossible. It is not the human mind in its finiteness which is to be blamed, but a primitive language with a structure foreign to this world, which was wrought havoc with our doctrines and institutions. The use of the term structure does not represent special difficulties when once we understand its origin and its meanings. The main difficulty is found in the old Aristotelian habits of speech, which do not allow the use of structure, as indeed this notion has no place in a complete Aristotelian subject-predicativism. Let us repeat once more the two crucial negative premises as established firmly by all human experience. 1. Words are not the things we are speaking about. And 2. There is no such thing as an object in absolute isolation. These two most important negative statements cannot be denied if anyone chooses to deny them. The burden of the proof falls on him. He has to establish what he affirms, which is obviously impossible. We see that it is safe to start with such solid negative premises, translate them into positive language, and build a non-Aristotelian system. If words are not things, or maps are not the actual territory, then obviously the only possible link between the objective world and the linguistic world is found in structure and structure alone. The only usefulness of a map or a language depends on the similarity of a structure between the empirical world and the map languages. If the structure is not similar, then the traveler or speaker is led astray, which in serious human life problems must become always eminently harmful, etc. If the structures are similar, then the empirical world becomes rational to a potentially rational being, which means no more than that verbal or map predicated characteristics, which follow up the linguistic or map structure, are applicable to the empirical world. In fact, in structure, we find the mystery of rationality, adjustment, etc., and we find that the whole content of knowledge is exclusively structural. If we want to be rational and to understand anything at all, we must look for structure, relations, and ultimately multi-dimensional order, all of which was impossible in a broader sense in the Aristotelian system, as will be explained later on. Having come to such important positive results, starting with undeniable negative premises, it is interesting to investigate whether these results are always possible, or if there are limitations. The second negative premise, namely that there is no such thing as an object in absolute isolation, gives us the answer. If there is no such thing as an absolutely isolated object, then, at least, we have two objects, and we shall always discover some relation between them, depending on our interest, ingenuity, and whatnot. Obviously, for a man to speak about anything at all, always presuppose two objects at least, namely the object spoken about and the speaker, and so a relation between the two is always present. Even in delusions, illusions, and hallucinations, the situation is not changed, because our immediate feelings are also unspeakable and not words. The semantic importance of the above should not be minimized. If we deal with organisms which possess an inherent activity, such as eating, breathing, etc., and if we should attempt to build for them conditions where such activity would be impossible or hampered, these imposed conditions would lead to degeneration or death. Similarly, with rationality, once we find in this world at least potentially rational organisms, we should not impose on them conditions which hamper or prevent the exercise of such an important and inherent function. The present analysis shows that under the all-pervading Aristotelianism in daily life, asymmetrical relations and thus structure and order have been impossible, and so we have been linguistically prevented from supplying the potentially rational being with the means for rationality. This resulted in a semi-human so-called civilization based on our copying animals in our nervous processes, which by necessity involves us in arrested development or regression, and in general disturbances of some sort. Under such conditions, which after all may be considered as firmly established, because this investigation is based on undeniable negative premises, there is no way out but to carry the analysis through and to build up a non-Aristotelian based on negative fundamental premises, or the denial of the is of identity, with which rationality will be possible. Perhaps an illustration will make it clearer. The more that the old subject-predicate language rather conceals structure. If we take a statement like the blade of grass is green and analyze it only as a statement superficially, we can hardly see how any structure could be implied by it. This statement may be analyzed into substantives, adjectives, verb, etc., yet this would not say much about its structure. But if we notice that these words can also make a question, like, is the blade of grass green? We begin to realize that the order of the words plays an important role in some languages connected with the meanings, and so we can immediately speak of the structure of the sentence. Further analysis would disclose that the sentence under consideration has the subject-predicate form of structure. If we went to the objective, silent, unspeakable level and analyzed this objective blade of grass, we should discover various structural characteristics in the blade. But these are not involved in the statement under consideration, and it would be illegitimate to speak about them. However, we can carry our analysis in another direction. If we carry it far enough, we shall discover a very intricate yet definite relation or complex of relations between the objective blade of grass and the observer. Rays of light impinge upon the blade, are reflected from it, fall on the retina of our eye, and produce within our skins the feeling of green, etc., an extremely complex process which has some definite structure. We see thus that any statement referring to anything objective in this world can always be analyzed into terms of relations and structure, and that it involves also definite structural assumptions. More than that, as the only possible content of knowledge and science is structural, whether we like it or not. To know anything, we must search for structure or posit some structure. Every statement can also be analyzed until we come to definite structural issues. This applies, however, with certainty only to significant statements, and perhaps not to the various noises which we can make with our mouth with the semblance of words, but which are meaningless as they are not symbols for anything. It must be added that in the older systems, we did not discriminate between words or symbols and noises, not symbols. In a non-Aristotelian system, such a discrimination is essential. The structure of the world is, in principle, unknown, and the only aim of knowledge and science is to discover the structure. The structure of languages is potentially known if we pay attention to it. Our only possible procedure in advancing our knowledge is to match our verbal structures, often called theories, with empirical structures, and see if our verbal predictions are fulfilled empirically or not, thus indicating that the two structures are either similar or dissimilar. We see thus that in the investigation of structure we find not only means for rationality and for adjustment, and so sanity, but also a most important tool for exploring this world and scientific advance. From the educational point of view, also, the results of such an investigation seem to be unusually important because they are extremely simple, automatic in their working, and can be applied universally in elementary education. As the issue is merely one of linguistic structure, it is enough to train children to abandon the is of identity in the habitual use of a few new terms, and to warn them repeatedly against the use of some terms of antiquated structure. We shall thus eliminate the pre-human and primitive semantic factors included in the structure of a primitive language. The moralizing and combating of primitive-made metaphysics is not effectual, but the habitual use of a language of modern structure, free from identity, produces semantic results where the old failed. Let us repeat again a most important point, that the new desirable semantic results follow as automatically as the old undesirable ones followed. It should be noticed that terms such as collection, fact, reality, function, relation, order, structure, characteristics, problem, etc. must be considered as multi-ordinal terms. See Part 7. And so, in general, infinitely valued and ambiguous. They become specific and one-valued only in a given context, or when the orders of abstractions are distinguished. In the following inquiry, an attempt to build a science of man, or a non-Aristotelian system, or a theory of sanity, is made, and it will be necessary to introduce a few terms of new structure and to abide by them. Let me be entirely frank about it. The main issues are found in the structure of language, and readers who are interested in this work will facilitate their task if they make themselves familiar with these new terms and use them habitually. This work will then appear simple and self-evident. For those other readers who insist on translating the new terms with new structural implications into their old habitual language and choose to retain the old terms with old structural implications and old semantic reactions, etc., this work will not appear simple. Examples illustrating what has just been said abound. Here I will mention only that the non-Euclidean geometries, the new revision of mathematics originated by Brouwer and Weyl, the Einstein theory, and the newer quantum mechanics, etc., have similar main aims, namely to produce non-elementalistic statements which are structurally closer to the empirical facts than the older theories, and to reject those unwarranted structural assumptions which vitiated the old theories. The reader should not be surprised to learn that these new theories are not a passing whim of scientists, but represent lasting advances in method. Whether these attempts at restatements are finally found to be valid or not, they remain steps in the right direction. It is quite natural that with the advance of experimental science, some generalizations should appear to be established from the facts at hand. Occasionally, such generalizations, when further analyzed, are found to contain serious structural, epistemological, and methodological implications and difficulties. In the present work, one of these empirical generalizations becomes of unusual importance. So important, indeed, the part 3 of this work is devoted to it. Here, however, it is only possible to mention it, and to show some rather unexpected consequences which it entails. That generalization states that any organism must be treated as a whole. In other words, that the organism is not an algebraic sum, a linear function of its elements, but always more than that. It is seemingly little realized at present that this simple and innocent-looking statement involves a full structural revision of our language, because that language of great pre-scientific antiquity is elementalistic, and so singularly inadequate to express non-elementalistic notions. Such a point of view involves profound structural, methodological, and semantic changes, vaguely anticipated but never formulated in a definite theory. The problems of structure, more, and non-additivity are very important and impossible to analyze in the old way. If this generalization be accepted, and on experimental, structural, and epistemological grounds, we cannot deny its complete structural justification, some odd consequences follow. That is to say, odd as long as we are not accustomed to them. For instance, we see that emotion and intellect cannot be divided, that this division structurally violates the organism as a whole generalization. We must then choose between the two. We must either abandon the organism as a whole principle, or abandon accepted speculations couched in elementalistic verbal terms, which create insoluble verbal puzzles. Something similar could be said about the distinction of body versus soul and other verbal splittings, which have hampered sane advance in the understanding of ourselves, and have filled for thousands of years the libraries and tribunes of the world with hollow reverberations. The solution of these problems lies in the field of structural, symbolic, linguistic, and semantic research, as well as in the fields of physics, chemistry, biology, psychiatry, etc., because from their very nature, these problems are structural.